Today, we embark on a fascinating journey through one of the most profound dialogues in Western philosophy. Join us as we delve into the conversation between Socrates and Meno, written by the great philosopher Plato. In this dialogue, they explore the nature of virtue, its teachability, and its inherent qualities. Let's dive into the timeless wisdom of ancient Greece. Meno, can you tell me, Socrates, whether virtue is acquired by teaching or by practice? Or if neither by teaching nor by practice, then whether it comes to man by nature or in what other way? Socrates. O Meno, there was a time when the Thessalians were famous among the other Hellenes only for their riches and their riding. But now, if I am not mistaken, they are equally famous for their wisdom, especially at Larissa, which is the native city of your friend Aristippus. And this is Gorgias's doing. For when he came there, the flower of the Aluae, among them your admirer Aristippus, and the other chiefs of the Thessalians, fell in love with his wisdom. And he has taught you the habit of answering questions in a grand and bold style, which becomes those who know, and is the style in which he himself answers all comers. And any Hellene who likes may ask him anything. How different is our lot, my dear Meno. Here at Athens, there is a dearth of the commodity, and all wisdom seems to have emigrated from us to you. I am certain that if you were to ask any Athenian whether virtue was natural or acquired, he would laugh in your face and say, "Stranger, you have far too good an opinion of me if you think that I can answer your question, for I literally do not know what virtue is, and much less whether it is acquired by teaching or not. And I myself, Meno, living as I do in this region of poverty, am as poor as the rest of the world. And I confess with shame that I know literally nothing about virtue. And when I do not know the quid of anything, how can I know the quale? How, if I knew nothing at all of Meno, could I tell if he was fair or the opposite of fair, rich and noble or the reverse of rich and noble? Do you think that I could? Meno, no, indeed. But are you in earnest, Socrates, in saying that you do not know what virtue is? And am I to carry back this report of you to Thessaly? Not only that, my dear boy, but you may say further that I have never known of anyone else who did, in my judgment. Then you have never met Gorgias when he was at Athens? Yes, I have. And did you not think that he knew? I have not a good memory, Meno, and therefore I cannot now tell what I thought of him at the time. And I dare say that he did know, and that you know what he said. Please, therefore, to remind me of what he said, or, if you would rather, tell me your own view, for I suspect that you and he think much alike. Very true. Then, as he is not here, never mind him, and do you tell me, by the gods, Meno, be generous, and tell me what you say that virtue is, for I shall be truly delighted to find that I have been mistaken, and that you and Gorgias do really have this knowledge, although I have been just saying that I have never found anybody who had. There will be no difficulty, Socrates, in answering your question. Let us take first the virtue of a man. He should know how to administer the state, and in the administration of it to benefit his friends and harm his enemies, and he must also be careful not to suffer harm himself. A woman's virtue, if you wish to know about that, may also be easily described. Her duty is to order her house and keep what is indoors and obey her husband. Every age, every condition of life, young or old, male or female, bond or free, has a different virtue. There are virtues numberless, and no lack of definitions of them, for virtue is relative to the actions and ages of each of us in all that we do. And the same may be said of vice, Socrates. Socrates, how fortunate I am, Meno. When I ask you for one virtue, you present me with a swarm of them, which are in your keeping. Suppose that I carry on the figure of the swarm and ask of you, what is the nature of the bee? And you answer that there are many kinds of bees, and I reply, but do bees differ as bees because there are many and different kinds of them? Or are they not rather to be distinguished by some other quality, as for example, beauty, size, or shape? How would you answer me? I should answer that bees do not differ from one another as bees. And if I went on to say, that is what I desire to know, Meno, tell me what is the quality in which they do not differ, but are all alike, would you be able to answer? I should. And so of the virtues, however many and different they may be, they have all a common nature which makes them virtues. And on this he who would answer the question, What is virtue? Would do well to have his eye fixed. Do you understand? I am beginning to understand, but I do not as yet take hold of the question as I could wish. When you say, Meno, that there is one virtue of a man, another of a woman, another of a child, and so on, does this apply only to virtue, or would you say the same of health and size and strength? Or is the nature of health always the same, whether in man or woman? I should say that health is the same, both in man and woman. And is not this true of size and strength? If a woman is strong, she will be strong by reason of the same form and of the same strength subsisting in her which there is in the man. I mean to say that strength as strength, whether of man or woman, is the same. Is there any difference? I think not. And will not virtue as virtue be the same, whether in a child or in a grown-up person, in a woman or in a man? I cannot help feeling, Socrates, that this case is different from the others. But why? Were you not saying that the virtue of a man was to order a state, and the virtue of a woman was to order a house? I did say so. And can either house or state or anything be well ordered without temperance and without justice? Certainly not. Then they who order a state or a house, temperately or justly, order them with temperance and justice? Certainly. Then both men and women, if they are to be good men and women, must have the same virtues of temperance and justice? True. And can either a young man or an elder one be good if they are intemperate and unjust? They cannot. They must be temperate and just? Yes. Then all men are good in the same way, and by participation in the same virtues? Such is the inference. And they surely would not have been good in the same way unless their virtue had been the same? They would not. Then now that the sameness of all virtue has been proven, try and remember what you and Gorgias say that virtue is. Will you have one definition of them all? That is what I am seeking. If you want to have one definition of them all, I know not what to say, but that virtue is the power of governing mankind.
Nature of sound and smell, and of many other similar phenomena. Meno, quite true. The answer Meno was in the orthodox solemn vein, and therefore was more acceptable to you than the other answer about figure. Yes. And yet, O son of Alexademus, I cannot help thinking that the other was the better, and I am sure that you would be of the same opinion if you would only stay and be initiated, and were not compelled, as you said yesterday, to go away before the mysteries. Meno, but I will stay, Socrates, if you will give me many such answers. Well then, for my own sake as well as for yours, I will do my very best, but I am afraid that I shall not be able to give you very many as good. And now, in your turn, you are to fulfill your promise, and tell me what virtue is in the universal, and do not make a singular into a plural, as the facetious say of those who break a thing, but deliver virtue to me whole and sound, and not broken into a number of pieces. I have given you the pattern. Well then, Socrates, virtue, as I take it, is when he who desires the honorable is able to provide it for himself. So the poet says, and I say too, virtue is the desire of things honorable and the power of attaining them. And does he who desires the honorable also desire the good? Certainly. Then are there some who desire the evil and others who desire the good? Do not all men, my dear sir, desire good? I think not. There are some who desire evil? Yes. Do you mean that they think the evils which they desire to be good, or do they know that they are evil and yet desire them? Both, I think. And do you really imagine, Meno, that a man knows evils to be evils and desires them notwithstanding? Certainly I do. And desire is of possession? Yes, of possession. And does he think that the evils will do good to him who possesses them, or does he know that they will do him harm? There are some who think that the evils will do them good, and others who know that they will do them harm. And in your opinion, do those who think that they will do them good know that they are evils? Certainly not. Is it not obvious that those who are ignorant of their nature do not desire them, but they desire what they suppose to be goods, although they are really evils? And if they are mistaken and suppose the evils to be goods, they really desire goods? Yes, in that case. Well, and do those who, as you say, desire evils and think that evils are hurtful to the possessor of them, know that they will be hurt by them? They must know it. And must they not suppose that those who are hurt are miserable in proportion to the hurt which is inflicted upon them? How can it be otherwise? But are not the miserable ill-fated? Yes, indeed. And does anyone desire to be miserable and ill-fated? I should say not, Socrates. But if there is no one who desires to be miserable, there is no one, Meno, who desires evil, for what is misery but the desire and possession of evil? That appears to be the truth, Socrates, and I admit that nobody desires evil. And yet, were you not saying just now that virtue is the desire and power of attaining good? Yes, I did say so. But if this be affirmed, then the desire of good is common to all, and one man is no better than another in that respect? True. And if one man is not better than another in desiring good, he must be better in the power of attaining it? Exactly. Then, according to your definition, virtue would appear to be the power of attaining good? I entirely approve, Socrates, of the manner in which you now view this matter. Then let us see whether what you say is true from another point of view, for very likely you may be right. You affirm virtue to be the power of attaining goods? Meno, yes. And the goods which you mean are such as health and wealth, and the possession of gold and silver, and having office and honor in the state. Those are what you would call goods? Yes, I should include all those. Then, according to Meno, who is the hereditary friend of the great king, virtue is the power of getting silver and gold. And would you add that they must be gained piously, justly, or do you deem this to be of no consequence? And is any mode of acquisition, even if unjust and dishonest, equally to be deemed virtue? Meno, not virtue, Socrates, but vice. Then justice or temperance or holiness or some other part of virtue, as would appear, must accompany the acquisition, and without them the mere acquisition of good will not be virtue. Why? How can there be virtue without these? And the non-acquisition of gold and silver in a dishonest manner for oneself or another, or in other words, the want of them, may be equally virtue? True. Then the acquisition of such goods is no more virtue than the non-acquisition and want of them. But whatever is accompanied by justice or honesty is virtue, and whatever is devoid of justice is vice. Meno, it cannot be otherwise, in my judgment. And were we not saying just now that justice, temperance, and the like, were each of them a part of virtue? Yes. And so, Meno, this is the way in which you mock me. Why do you say that, Socrates? Why? Because I asked you to deliver virtue into my hands whole and unbroken, and I gave you a pattern according to which you were to frame your answer, and you have forgotten already, and tell me that virtue is the power of attaining good justly, or with justice, and justice you acknowledge to be a part of virtue, yes. Then if we add a half to this line of 2, that will be the line of 3. Here are 2 and there is 1, and on the other side here are 2 also, and there is 1. And that makes the figure of which you speak. Yes. But if there are 3 feet this way and 3 feet that way, the whole space will be 3 times 3 feet. That is evident. And how much are 3 times 3 feet? 9. And how much is the double of 4? 8. Then the figure of 8 is not made out of a line of 3. No. But from what line? Tell me exactly. And if you would rather not reckon, try and show me the line. Indeed, Socrates, I do not know. Do you see, Meno, what advances he has made in his power of recollection? He did not know at first, and he does not know now, what is the side of a figure of 8 feet, but then he thought that he knew, and answered confidently as if he knew, and had no difficulty. Now he has a difficulty, and neither knows nor fancies that he knows. Meno, true. Is he not better off in knowing his ignorance? I think that he is. If we have made him doubt, and given him the torpedo's shock, have we done him any harm? I think not. We have certainly, as would seem, assisted him in some degree to the discovery of the truth. And now he will wish to remedy his ignorance. But then he would have been ready to tell all the world again and again that the double space should have a double side. True. But do you suppose that he would ever have inquired into or learned what he fancied that he knew, though he was really ignorant of it, until he had fallen into perplexity under the idea that he did not know and had desired to know? I think not, Socrates. Then he was the better for the torpedo's touch? I think so. Mark now the farther development. I shall only ask him and not teach him, and he shall share the inquiry with me. And do you watch and see if you find me telling or explaining anything to him, instead of eliciting his opinion. Tell me, boy, is not this a square of 4 feet which I have drawn? Yes. And now I add another square equal to the former one? Yes. And a third, which is equal to either of them? Yes. Suppose that we fill up the vacant corner? Very good. Here then there are 4 equal spaces? Yes. And how many times larger is this space than this other? 4 times.
Even the acknowledged gentlemen are sometimes saying that this thing can be taught, and sometimes the opposite. Can you say that they are teachers in any true sense whose ideas are in such confusion? Meno, I should say, certainly not. But if neither the sophists nor the gentlemen are teachers, clearly there can be no other teachers? No. And if there are no teachers, neither are there disciples? Agreed. And we have admitted that a thing cannot be taught of which there are neither teachers nor disciples. We have. And there are no teachers of virtue to be found anywhere? There are not. And if there are no teachers, neither are there scholars? That, I think, is true. Then virtue cannot be taught? Not if we are right in our view. But I cannot believe, Socrates, that there are no good men. And if there are, how did they come into existence? Socrates, I am afraid, Meno, that you and I are not good for much, and that Gorgias has been as poor an educator of you as Prodicus has been of me. Certainly we shall have to look to ourselves and try to find someone who will help in some way or other to improve us. This I say, because I observe that in the previous discussion none of us remarked that right and good action is possible to man under other guidance than that of knowledge, episteme. And indeed, if this be denied, there is no seeing how there can be any good men at all. How do you mean, Socrates? I mean that good men are necessarily useful or profitable. Were we not right in admitting this? It must be so. Yes, and in supposing that they will be useful only if they are true guides to us of action. There we were also right. But when we said that a man cannot be a good guide unless he have knowledge, phronesis, this we were wrong. What do you mean by the word right? I will explain. If a man knew the way to Larissa or anywhere else, and went to the place and led others thither, would he not be a right and good guide? Certainly. And a person who had a right opinion about the way but had never been and did not know might be a good guide also, might he not? Certainly. And while he has true opinion about that which the other knows, he will be just as good a guide if he thinks the truth as he who knows the truth? Exactly. Then true opinion is as good a guide to correct action as knowledge. And that was the point which we omitted in our speculation about the nature of virtue, when we said that knowledge only is the guide of right action, whereas there is also right opinion. True. Then right opinion is not less useful than knowledge? The difference, Socrates, is only that he who has knowledge will always be right, but he who has right opinion will sometimes be right and sometimes not. What do you mean? Can he be wrong who has right opinion, so long as he has right opinion? I admit the cogency of your argument, and therefore, Socrates, I wonder that knowledge should be preferred to right opinion, or why they should ever differ. And shall I explain this wonder to you? Do tell me. And the right guide is useful and good? Certainly. And the only right guides are knowledge and true opinion. These are the guides of man. For things which happen by chance are not under the guidance of man, but the guides of man are true opinion and knowledge. Meno, I think so too. But if virtue is not taught, neither is virtue knowledge. Clearly not. Then of two good and useful things, one, which is knowledge, has been set aside and cannot be supposed to be our guide in political life. I think not. And therefore not by any wisdom, and not because they were wise, did Themistocles and those others of whom Anytus spoke govern states. This was the reason why they were unable to make others like themselves, because their virtue was not grounded in knowledge. That is probably true, Socrates. But if not by knowledge, the only alternative which remains is that statesmen must have guided states by right opinion, which is in politics what divination is in religion. For diviners and also prophets say many things truly, but they know not what they say. So I believe. And may we not, Meno, truly call those men divine who, having no understanding, yet succeed in many a grand deed and word? Certainly. Then we shall also be right in calling divine those whom we were just now speaking of as diviners and prophets, including the whole tribe of poets. Yes, and statesmen above all may be said to be divine and illumined, being inspired and possessed of God, in which condition they say many grand things, not knowing what they say. Yes, and the women too, Meno, call good men divine, do they not? And the Spartans, when they praise a good man, say that he is a divine man. And I think, Socrates, that they are right, although very likely our friend Anytus may take offense at the word. I do not care. As for Anytus, there will be another opportunity to talk with him. To sum up our inquiry, the result seems to be, if we are at all right in our view, that virtue is neither natural nor acquired, but an instinct given by God to the virtuous. Nor is the instinct accompanied by reason, unless there may be supposed to be among statesmen someone capable of educating statesmen. And if there be such a one, he may be said to be among the living, what Homer says that Tiresias was among the dead. He alone has understanding, but the rest are flitting shades, and he and his virtue in like manner will be a reality among shadows. Meno. That is excellent, Socrates. Then, Meno, the conclusion is that virtue comes to the virtuous by the gift of God. But we shall never know the certain truth until, before asking how virtue is given, we inquire into the actual nature of virtue. I fear that I must go away, but do you, now that you have persuaded yourself, persuade our friend Anytus? And do not let him be so exasperated. If you can conciliate him, you will have done good service to the Athenian people.
In this video, we delve into the timeless dialogue between Socrates and Meno, penned by the great philosopher Plato. This conversation explores profound questions about virtue, knowledge, and the human soul, topics that remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Greece. By examining these philosophical discussions, we gain valuable insights into the nature of wisdom and the pursuit of a virtuous life. Join us as we uncover the enduring significance of Plato's Meno and its impact on philosophical thought throughout the ages. This dialogue begins abruptly with a question of Meno, who asks whether virtue can be taught. Socrates replies that he does not as yet know what virtue is, and has never known anyone who did. Then he cannot have met Gorgias when he was at Athens. Yes, Socrates had met him, but he has a bad memory and has forgotten what Gorgias said. Will Meno tell him his own notion, which is probably not very different from that of Gorgias? Oh yes, nothing easier. There is the virtue of a man, of a woman, of an old man, and of a child. There is a virtue of every age and state of life, all of which may be easily described. Socrates reminds Meno that this is only an enumeration of the virtues and not a definition of the notion which is common to them all. In a second attempt, Meno defines virtue to be the power of command, but to this again, exceptions are taken. For there must be a virtue of those who obey, as well as of those who command, and the power of command must be justly or not unjustly exercised. Meno is very ready to admit that justice is virtue. Would you say virtue or a virtue? For there are other virtues, such as courage, temperance, and the like. Just as round is a figure, and black and white are colours, and yet there are other figures and other colours. Let Meno take the examples of figure and colour, and try to define them. Meno confesses his inability, and after a process of interrogation, in which Socrates explains to him the nature of a simile in multis, Socrates himself defines figure as the accompaniment of colour. But someone may object that he does not know the meaning of the word colour, and if he is a candid friend and not a mere disputant, Socrates is willing to furnish him with a simpler and more philosophical definition, into which no disputed word is allowed to intrude. Figure is the limit of form. Meno imperiously insists that he must still have a definition of colour. Some raillery follows, and at length Socrates is induced to reply, "That colour is the effluence of form, sensible and in due proportion to the sight." This definition is exactly suited to the taste of Meno, who welcomes the familiar language of Gorgias and Empedocles. Socrates is of opinion that the more abstract or dialectical definition of figure is far better. Now that Meno has been made to understand the nature of a general definition, he answers in the spirit of a Greek gentleman, and in the words of a poet, that virtue is to delight in things honourable, and to have the power of getting them. This is a nearer approximation than he has yet made to a complete definition, and, regarded as a piece of proverbial or popular morality, is not far from the truth. But the objection is urged, that the honourable is the good, and as everyone equally desires the good, the point of the definition is contained in the words, the power of getting them. And they must be got justly or with justice. The definition will then stand thus: virtue is the power of getting good with justice. But justice is a part of virtue, and therefore virtue is the getting of good with a part of virtue. The definition repeats the word defined. Meno complains that the conversation of Socrates has the effect of a torpedo's shock upon him. When he talks with other persons, he has plenty to say about virtue. In the presence of Socrates, his thoughts desert him. Socrates replies that he is only the cause of perplexity in others, because he is himself perplexed. He proposes to continue the inquiry. But how, asks Meno, can he inquire either into what he knows or into what he does not know? This is a sophistical puzzle, which, as Socrates remarks, saves a great deal of trouble to him who accepts it. But the puzzle has a real difficulty latent under it, to which Socrates will endeavour to find a reply. The difficulty is the origin of knowledge. He has heard from priests and priestesses, and from the poet Pindar, of an immortal soul which is born again and again in successive periods of existence, returning into this world when she has paid the penalty of ancient crime, and, having wandered over all places of the upper and under world, and seen and known all things at one time or other, is by association out of one thing capable of recovering all. For nature is of one kindred, and every soul has a seed or germ which may be developed into all knowledge. The existence of this latent knowledge is further proved by the interrogation of one of Meno's slaves, who, in the skillful hands of Socrates, is made to acknowledge some elementary relations of geometrical figures. The theorem that the square of the diagonal is double the square of the side, that famous discovery of primitive mathematics, in honour of which the legendary Pythagoras is said to have sacrificed a hecatomb, is elicited from him. The first step in the process of teaching has made him conscious of his own ignorance. He has had the torpedo's shock given him, and is the better for the operation. But whence had the uneducated man this knowledge? He had never learnt geometry in this world, nor was it born with him. He must therefore have had it when he was not a man. And as he always either was or was not a man, he must have always had it. After Socrates has given this specimen of the true nature of teaching, the original question of the teachableness of virtue is renewed. Again, he professes a desire to know what virtue is first. But he is willing to argue the question, as mathematicians say, under an hypothesis. He will assume that if virtue is knowledge, then virtue can be taught. This was the stage of the argument at which the Protagoras concluded. Socrates has no difficulty in showing that virtue is a good, and that goods, whether of body or mind, must be under the direction of knowledge. Upon the assumption just made, then, virtue is teachable. But where are the teachers? There are none to be found. This is extremely discouraging. Virtue is no sooner discovered to be teachable than the discovery follows that it is not taught. Virtue, therefore, is and is not teachable. In this dilemma, an appeal is made to Anytus, a respectable and well-to-do citizen of the old school, and a family friend of Meno who happens to be present. He is asked whether Meno shall go to the sophists and be taught. The suggestion throws him into a rage. To whom then shall Meno go, asks Socrates. To any Athenian gentleman, to the great Athenian statesman of past times. Socrates replies here, as elsewhere, laches prot, that Themistocles, Pericles, and other great men had sons to whom they would surely, if they could have done so, have imparted their own political wisdom. But no one ever heard that these sons of theirs were remarkable for anything except riding and wrestling and similar accomplishments. Anytus is angry at the imputation which is cast on his favourite statesman, and on a class to which he supposes himself to belong. He breaks off with a significant hint. The mention of another opportunity of talking with him, and the suggestion that Meno may do the Athenian people a service by pacifying him, are evident allusions to the trial of Socrates. Socrates returns to the consideration of the question whether virtue is teachable, which was denied on the ground that there are no teachers of it, for the sophists are bad teachers, and the rest of the world do not profess to teach. But there is another point which we failed to observe, and in which Gorgias has never instructed Meno, nor Prodicus Socrates. This is the nature of right opinion. For virtue may be under the guidance of right opinion as well as of knowledge, and right opinion is for practical purposes as good as knowledge, but is incapable of being taught, and is also liable, like the images of Daedalus, to walk off, because not bound by the tie of the cause. This is the sort of instinct which is possessed by statesmen who are not wise or knowing persons, but only inspired or divine. The higher virtue, which is identical with knowledge, is an ideal only. If the statesman had this knowledge and could teach what he knew, he would be like Tiresias in the world below. He alone has wisdom, but the rest flit like shadows. This dialogue is an attempt to answer the question, can virtue be taught? No one would either ask or answer such a question in modern times. But in the age of Socrates, it was only by an effort that the mind could rise to a general notion of virtue as distinct from the particular virtues of courage, liberality, and the like. And when a hazy conception of this ideal was attained, it was only by a further effort that the question of the teachableness of virtue could be resolved. The answer which is given by Plato is paradoxical enough, and seems rather intended to stimulate than to satisfy enquiry. Virtue is knowledge, and therefore virtue can be taught. But virtue is not taught, and therefore in this higher and
To the doctrine that virtue is knowledge, Plato has been constantly tending in the previous dialogues. But the new truth is no sooner found than it vanishes away. If there is knowledge, there must be teachers. And where are the teachers? There is no knowledge in the higher sense of systematic, connected, reasoned knowledge, such as may one day be attained, and such as Plato himself seems to see in some far-off vision of a single science. And there are no teachers in the higher sense of the word, that is to say, no real teachers who will arouse the spirit of inquiry in their pupils, and not merely instruct them in rhetoric or impart to them ready-made information for a fee of 1 or of 50 drachms. Plato is desirous of deepening the notion of education, and therefore he asserts the paradox that there are no educators. This paradox, though different in form, is not really different from the remark which is often made in modern times by those who would depreciate either the methods of education commonly employed or the standard attained, that there is no true education among us. There remains still a possibility which must not be overlooked. Even if there be no true knowledge, as is proved by the wretched state of education, there may be right opinion, which is a sort of guessing or divination resting on no knowledge of causes and incommunicable to others. This is the gift which our statesmen have, as is proved by the circumstance that they are unable to impart their knowledge to their sons. Those who are possessed of it cannot be said to be men of science or philosophers, but they are inspired and divine. There may be some trace of irony in this curious passage, which forms the concluding portion of the dialogue. But Plato certainly does not mean to intimate that the supernatural or divine is the true basis of human life. To him, knowledge, if only attainable in this world, is of all things the most divine. Yet, like other philosophers, he is willing to admit that probability is the guide of life, Butler's analogy. And he is at the same time desirous of contrasting the wisdom which governs the world with a higher wisdom. There are many instincts, judgments, and anticipations of the human mind which cannot be reduced to rule, and of which the grounds cannot always be given in words. A person may have some skill or latent experience which he is able to use himself and is yet unable to teach others because he has no principles and is incapable of collecting or arranging his ideas. He has practice but not theory, art but not science. This is a true fact of psychology which is recognized by Plato in this passage. But he is far from saying, as some have imagined, that inspiration or divine grace is to be regarded as higher than knowledge. He would not have preferred the poet or man of action to the philosopher, or the virtue of custom to the virtue based upon ideas. Also here, as in the Ion and Phaedrus, Plato appears to acknowledge an unreasoning element in the higher nature of man. The philosopher only has knowledge, and yet the statesman and the poet are inspired. There may be a sort of irony in regarding in this way the gifts of genius, but there is no reason to suppose that he is deriding them any more than he is deriding the phenomena of love or of enthusiasm in the Symposium, or of oracles in the Apology, or of divine intimations when he is speaking of the demonium of Socrates. He recognizes the lower form of right opinion, as well as the higher one of science, in the spirit of one who desires to include in his philosophy every aspect of human life, just as he recognizes the existence of popular opinion as a fact, and the sophists as the expression of it. This dialogue contains the first intimation of the doctrine of reminiscence and of the immortality of the soul. The proof is very slight, even slighter than in the Phaedo and Republic. Because men had abstract ideas in a previous state, they must have always had them, and their souls, therefore, must have always existed, for they must always have been either men or not men. The fallacy of the latter words is transparent. And Socrates himself appears to be conscious of their weakness, for he adds immediately afterwards, "I have said some things of which I am not altogether confident." Compare Phaedo. It may be observed, however, that the fanciful notion of pre-existence is combined with a true but partial view of the origin and unity of knowledge and of the association of ideas. Knowledge is prior to any particular knowledge and exists not in the previous state of the individual, but of the race. It is potential, not actual, and can only be appropriated by strenuous exertion. The idealism of Plato is here presented in a less developed form than in the Phaedo and Phaedrus. Nothing is said of the pre-existence of ideas of justice, temperance, and the like. Nor is Socrates positive of anything but the duty of inquiry. The doctrine of reminiscence, too, is explained more in accordance with fact and experience, as arising out of the affinities of nates thusios olus sagunis auses. Modern philosophy says that all things in nature are dependent on one another. The ancient philosopher had the same truth latent in his mind when he affirmed that out of one thing all the rest may be recovered. The subjective was converted by him into an objective. The mental phenomenon of the association of ideas, compare Phaedo, became a real chain of existences. The germs of two valuable principles of education may also be gathered from the words of priests and priestesses. One, that true knowledge is a knowledge of causes, compare Aristotle's theory of episteme. And two, that the process of learning consists not in what is brought to the learner, but in what is drawn out of him. Some lesser points of the dialogue may be noted, such as 1. The acute observation that Meno prefers the familiar definition, which is embellished with poetical language, to the better and truer one, or 2. The shrewd reflection, which may admit of an application to modern as well as to ancient teachers, that the sophists having made large fortunes. This must surely be a criterion of their powers of teaching, for that no man could get a living by shoemaking who was not a good shoemaker. Or 3. The remark conveyed, almost in a word, that the verbal skeptic is saved the labor of thought and inquiry, odende to toiutosetizios. Characteristic also of the temper of the Socratic enquiry is 4. The proposal to discuss the teachableness of virtue under an hypothesis after the manner of the mathematicians, and 5. The repetition of the favorite doctrine which occurs so frequently in the earlier and more Socratic dialogues and gives a color to all of them, that mankind only desire evil through ignorance. 6. The experiment of eliciting from the slave boy the mathematical truth which is latent in him, and 7. The remark that he is all the better for knowing his ignorance. The character of Meno, like that of Critias, has no relation to the actual circumstances of his life. Plato is silent about his treachery to the 10,000 Greeks, which Xenophon has recorded, as he is also silent about the crimes of Critias. He is a Thessalian Alcibiades, rich and luxurious, a spoilt child of fortune, and is described as the hereditary friend of the great king. Like Alcibiades, he is inspired with an ardent desire of knowledge and is equally willing to learn of Socrates and of the Sophists. He may be regarded as standing in the same relation to Gorgias as Hippocrates in the Protagoras to the other great sophist. He is the sophisticated youth on whom Socrates tries his cross-examining powers, just as in the Charmides, the Lysis, and the Euthydemus. Ingenuous boyhood is made the subject of a similar experiment. He is treated by Socrates in a half-playful manner suited to his character. At the same time, he appears not quite to understand the process to which he is being subjected. For he is exhibited as ignorant of the very elements of dialectics in which the sophists have failed to instruct their disciple. His definition of virtue as the power and desire of attaining things honorable, like the first definition of justice in the Republic, is taken from a poet. His answers have a sophistical ring, and at the same time show the sophistical incapacity to grasp a general notion. Anytus is the type of the narrow-minded man of the world who is indignant at innovation and equally detests the popular teacher and the true philosopher. He seems, like Aristophanes, to regard the new opinions, whether of Socrates or the Sophists, as fatal to Athenian greatness. He is of the same class as Callicles in the Gorgias, but of a different variety. The immoral and sophistical doctrines of Callicles are not attributed to him. The moderation with which he is described is remarkable, if he be the accuser of Socrates, as is apparently indicated by his parting words. Perhaps Plato may have been desirous of showing that the accusation of Socrates was not to be attributed to badness or malevolence, but rather to a tendency in men's minds. Or he may have been regardless of the historical truth of the characters of his dialogue, as in the case of Meno and Critias. Like Xenophon, Apple, the real Anytus was a democrat and had joined Thrasybulus in the conflict with the 30.
The Protagoras arrived at a sort of hypothetical conclusion that if virtue is knowledge, it can be taught. In the Euthydemus, Socrates himself offered an example of the manner in which the true teacher may draw out the mind of youth. This was in contrast to the quibbling follies of the sophists. In the Meno, the subject is more developed. The foundations of the inquiry are laid deeper, and the nature of knowledge is more distinctly explained. There is a progression by antagonism of two opposite aspects of philosophy. But at the moment when we approach nearest, the truth doubles upon us and passes out of our reach. We seem to find that the ideal of knowledge is irreconcilable with experience. In human life, there is indeed the profession of knowledge, but right opinion is our actual guide. There is another sort of progress from the general notions of Socrates, who asked simply, what is friendship? What is temperance? What is courage? As in the Lysis, Charmides, Locks, to the transcendentalism of Plato, who, in the second stage of his philosophy, sought to find the nature of knowledge in a prior and future state of existence. The difficulty in framing general notions which has appeared in this and in all the previous dialogues recurs in the Gorgias and Theaetetus as well as in the Republic. In the Gorgias, too, the statesmen reappear, but in stronger opposition to the philosopher. They are no longer allowed to have a divine insight, but though acknowledged to have been clever men and good speakers, are denounced as blind leaders of the blind. The doctrine of the immortality of the soul is also carried further, being made the foundation not only of a theory of knowledge, but of a doctrine of rewards and punishments. In the Republic, the relation of knowledge to virtue is described in a manner more consistent with modern distinctions. The existence of the virtues without the possession of knowledge, in the higher or philosophical sense, is admitted to be possible. Right opinion is again introduced in the Theaetus as an account of knowledge, but is rejected on the ground that it is irrational, as here, because it is not bound by the tie of the cause, and also because the conception of false opinion is given up as hopeless. The doctrines of Plato are necessarily different at different times of his life, as new distinctions are realized, or new stages of thought attained by him. We are not therefore justified in order to take away the appearance of inconsistency in attributing to him hidden meanings or remote allusions. There are no external criteria by which we can determine the date of the Meno. There is no reason to suppose that any of the dialogues of Plato were written before the death of Socrates. The Meno, which appears to be one of the earliest of them, is proved to have been of a later date by the illusion of Anytus. We cannot argue that Plato was more likely to have written, as he has done, of Meno before than after his miserable death, for we have already seen in the examples of Charmides and Critias that the characters in Plato are very far from resembling the same characters in history. The repulsive picture which is given of him in the Anabasis of Xenophon, where he also appears as the friend of Aristippus and a fair youth having lovers, has no other trait of likeness to the Meno of Plato. The place of the Meno in the series is doubtfully indicated by internal evidence. The main character of the dialogue is Socrates, but to the general definitions of Socrates is added the Platonic doctrine of reminiscence. The problems of virtue and knowledge have been discussed in the Lysis, Laches, Charmides, and Protagoras. The puzzle about knowing and learning has already appeared in the Euthydemus. The doctrines of immortality and pre-existence are carried further in the Phaedrus and Phaedo. The distinction between opinion and knowledge is more fully developed in the Theaetetus. The lessons of Prodicus, whom he facetiously calls his master, are still running in the mind of Socrates. Unlike the later Platonic dialogues, the Meno arrives at no conclusion. Hence, we are led to place the dialogue at some point of time later than the Protagoras and earlier than the Phaedrus and Gorgias. The place which is assigned to it in this work is due mainly to the desire to bring together in a single volume all the dialogues which contain allusions to the trial and death of Socrates.